On December 1st, 1948, the discovery of a man's body on Somerton Park Beach in Adelaide, South Australia, set in motion one of perhaps the most profounding and enduring mysteries in modern criminal history. The scene itself was immediately puzzling. The man was found slumped against a sea wall. He was dressed in a fashionable suit and tie, with his legs extended and his feet crossed. He had a half-smoked, unlit cigar resting upon his shoulder. The meticulous presentation of his body, coupled with the absence of any sign of struggle or violence, led initial investigators to theorize the man may have died in his sleep, as you do, falling asleep on a beach in seemingly the middle of nowhere with no one around. Today, we're going to be talking about the Somerton Man case. Hi, and welcome to the Decomposing Flower. I'm Kira, and with me is Jen. Everything we say is hopefully as truthful as we can get. We do try to say everything truthfully, but if we get anything wrong, you can let us know. Always start a discussion down in the comments. We love to hear about it. Today, we're going to be discussing the Somerton Man case. Let's get into it. So the man appeared to be of British descent. He was later described pathologist named John Cleland to be in top physical condition. He was estimated to be between 40 and 45 years old. He stood at 5 feet 11 inches. He had fair to ginger-colored hair. He had broad shoulders and a narrow waist. Closer examination of his hands and nails revealed that they were clean and well kept. They showed no sign of manual labor, which led Cleland to classify him as being an office worker of some sort, maybe. They made a portrait of the man, but it was so weird that this seemingly well-kept man lay dead on a public beach without a name, without a story. He seemingly was in a healthy physical state, but why was his body left out there? Two specific anatomical details were later identified that would become central to the surrounding mystery of the case. The man's calf muscles were unusually high and well developed, and that his big and little toe met in a wedge shape. An expert at the inquest speculated that these traits were unique of a ballet dancer or someone who wore high-heeled boots. This unique set of physical attributes, combined with his unexplained death, served as a foundational element for lots and lots of theories about his identity and his profession that we will get into today. The man's pockets held several items, none of which offered any clues to who he was. They contained an unused second-class rail ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach, a bus ticket, a narrow American-made cone, half an empty packet of chewing gum, an Army Club cigarette packet with 7 cigarettes inside, a different brand from cigarette that was on his shoulder, and a box of matches. The most perplexing thing was Mans didn't have any money, he didn't have a wallet, he didn't have any ID, which led investigators to believe that these items had been removed. Early witnesses did describe this man. They saw him around the beach at 7 p.m., November 30th, 1948, and observed him extend his right arm fully, then drop it limply. Another couple saw him between 7:30 and 8 p.m. and noted he remained motionless for over half an hour. Through his position, he appeared to shift slightly, but not like doing jumping jacks or playing around on the beach. He was just standing there. So the case remained cold for a little bit before they found 2 clues that became important to the investigation. These were a small note which turned his death into potential ties into espionage. The first major breakthrough occurred on June 6, 1949, when police re-examined the trousers. They were able to find a small hidden pocket that had been overlooked. Inside this compartment, there was a tiny scrap of paper with 2 words printed on it, Tamam Shud. This is a Persian phrase that translates to "it is ended" or "it is finished." This cryptic note led authorities to conclude that something was very strange about this body. You know, just like not to be expected when you find a body on the beach, I guess. Forensics quickly determined that this paper had been torn from the very last page of a rare edition of a 12th century poetry book. Yeah, I'm gonna mess this up though. Rabidat of Omar Khayyam. So eventually they were trying to find this book And a man who went by an alias of Ron Francis eventually came forward in July 22nd of the following year and reported that his brother-in-law had found a copy of it in his unlocked car, which had been parked in Jeffrey Road in Glenlig near the crime scene a couple months earlier. They were able to analyze that this was indeed the correct book, and it matched the fragment found in the man's pocket, which created a powerful link between the two. On the inside back cover, faint indentations of previous writings were noticed by an investigating officer. When they traced this, it revealed a local phone number and a series of cryptid letters. The phone number was traced back to a nurse named Jessica Jenston Thomason, who lived a 5-minute walk from where the body was found. The letters, which resembled a 5-line coded message, was sent to Naval Intelligence, and they deemed it unbreakable. For decades, they thought that this was a Cold War espionage theory, but it was so weird that there was also like a local woman who was involved. Things were just not making sense. But later on, they were able to find a brown suitcase, which had been left uncollected at Adelaide Railway Station. Police were able to connect the luggage to the deceased man through a unique reel of orange wax thread inside it, which was identical to the thread used to repair the lining of the man's trousers. The contents of the suitcase were interesting as well. There was a dressing gown, slippers, pajamas, suggesting that Home Dog was going to stay overnight somewhere. It also included an electrician's screwdriver, a table knife, which had been modified very sharply, and sharpened scissors. The most perplexing detail, however, was the removal of pretty much all the clothing labels, reinforcing the idea that he was trying to hide his identity. But there was also the presence of a name T. Kine on a tie and a laundry bag. So going back to the body, the autopsy, they were able to find that the man's heart was normal. However, there was a significant congestion in his internal organs, namely the brain, liver, and spleen. The most striking observation was that his spleen was very large and firm, about 3 times the size of a normal spleen. They also found blood mixed in with his stomach. But there was also a pastry that he had eaten probably about 3 to 4 hours before he had died. They did a toxicology test on his blood, but there was a failure to reveal any foreign substances. So they were at a loss for how he actually died. They thought initially it would be poison, but with not finding anything in his blood or anything, they were at a loss. There was the possibility that these very rare, highly toxic drugs may have decomposed very early after death, but it was so weird that this would have been used on a regular Joe Schmo, seemingly. Let's get into the theories. We'll circle back. Remember Jessica, the phone number, the back of the book, right? So obviously the police investigated this lead. She was a nurse. She lived close to the beach. She was a bit evasive. When police showed her a plaster case of the man's deceased face, she reacted with profound shock and appeared to be completely taken aback to the point where she was about to faint. Despite this kind of recognition, she firmly denied knowing him and refused to look at him a second time. Maybe it was that he died of a broken heart or a scandalous affair and it was suicide, or that he chose to end it all. I mean, it kind of makes sense with like the whole paper saying it is ended. Maybe he was being dramatic and that was why she had an emotional reaction. Or maybe he was a spurned lover that chose to end his life and leave the police constantly knocking on her door. And that would have hurt her reputation as well, right? Maybe it was that. But it was so weird that they couldn't figure out how he died. So circling back to espionage, this happened post World War II in like the early stages of the Cold War. There was a lot of ideas of espionage floating around. Everyone was scared of Rand with this. The evidence around the whole case kind of supported this as well, especially with the seemingly unbreakable coded message found on the back of the book. And the untraceable poison? Perhaps. This is also very similar to another case, the death of Joseph Marshall, who was also found with a copy of the same book on his chest. Two theories was one of personal tragedy and one was that he was a international super spy. So it had been about 7 decades before anything happened on this case. Things remained cold. There was no leads after the first initial go of it. But now with today's technology, we're able to do genetic testing on it. They were able to take some of the hairs from his face that was put in the plaster, and they were able to match the DNA to a distant cousin of the Somerton Man. They constructed a family tree that grew to approximately 4,000 people, leading them to make a potential match. Charles Webb, who is an electrical engineer and instrument maker from Melbourne, who had no record of his death. The identification of Harrow Webb as the Somerton Man, while wasn't official, it was confirmed by the Australian police that it was circumstantial and it might have been him, but there were still things that didn't quite add up. The presence of T. Keane on the suitcase clothing suggested that Webb had a brother-in-law named Thomas Keane or something, suggesting that the clothes were hand-me-downs maybe, and that's why the name was there. But records show that Webb had separated from his wife, who had moved away from Australia in 1948, which possibly could have been a motive for him being in the area. Furthermore, his background aligned with the evidence of the book. His divorce papers revealed that he was fond of writing poetry, and he was described as being a moody, violent man with a few friends. He often wrote poems about death, and this whole poetry correlates with the book and the themes of fate and self-exiting, and it could have been a whole spurned lover situation again. The case of the Somerton Man is still ongoing. For 73 years, it's captivated the world, and it leaves a man with no official identity, a mysterious note, an unbreakable code, and an unexplained death. It could be that it was Charles Webb. There's so many questions that remain unanswered, and I wish I had an answer for you because I always hate leaving these with open-ended questions. But there's, just an unsolved mystery that we might never know. And that's where I'm going to leave you with today's case. If you have any case suggestions, we have a Google form for that, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.